Hey guys, so I'm here at the Theology House to answer your questions. So I wrote my paper on Prayer from the Martins, comparing Billy Graham and Martin Luther King, contrasting their prayer views of prayer in connection with um, a lot of it had to do with their connection to theological anthropology, so preferences to the soul and the body, um, as well as their views on the government, um, their views on human action in response to the divine. So those are all important things in the background. So to give an intro on that may have not come out as clear in the paper, um, King seems to give more of a preference or more high importance to the body um, than Billy Graham did. So he was more about soul winning, which is why I pointed that out in his evangelistic tactics than King, who was very concerned about the plight of the black communities that he was a part of. And so that comes out a lot in his prayer life. Um, okay, so to get to the questions, I'll answer Drenda's first. So, Drenda, you said, quote, you boldly claim um, that he, referring to Billy Graham, was a racist without offering substantial evidence, and you also end quote, and also that I made an ad hominem attack quite frequently against him. So my response to that is the reason I made claims that um, he was racist was that he admitted it himself, and I mentioned that in a footnote actually. It's a footnote on page. Sorry, the footnote is actually footnote 7, and so that's going to be Michael G. Long's Billy Graham and the Beloved Community, that work, pages 80 to 82. And in that section, on actually page 80, Billy Graham says that even after he was converted to Christianity, he still remained racist. And so that comes out in the way that he approached segregation. He didn't desegregate his revivals. And so one could claim, well, that's because he wanted to convert more people, but I guess that might deal with more of a question of what racism is. So perhaps he didn't have in his heart this outright hatred of black persons at some point in his ministry where he still was segregating his revivals. But is that still racism? Is it still racism if you care more about people walking away because you treat black people as equal? To me, that still is racism, even if in your heart you don't have this disposition of hatred, you still show it in your actions that is still racist. And so that might be where we differ, but also if you need more information on this from Billy Graham himself, a book that he wrote on, it's called the Quiet Revolution. And on page 345, that book would help quite a bit on his own confession of racism. And okay, and then your second question was there a specific event that turned him away from racism? So it's not quite black and white. Even in Graham says it wasn't. He in that same book by Michael G. Long, on page 80, he says that there is no one point in his life that he could point to and say, I was no longer racist because of that event. Now, I'm sure his relationship with Martin Luther King had a lot to do with what influenced him. Um, he, some of the more skeptical scholars think that his turning away from racism had more to do with his desire to save souls. So it was more of an evangelistic motivation, which would not paint him a very good light. Now, I don't I don't really know what claim to make with that regard, so I didn't put that in my paper. But I did make connections between, um, you know, the soul being primary and important, and bodily equality is not as important. All that really matters is that the soul gets saved. Um, for a lot of these evangelists at this time, so I think that was fair for me to point out. Um, okay, so I think that is it for Drenna's questions. Okay, so, oh, sorry, one more question you had. What social issues call for integration of human and divine audience? So I talked about in the example of performative prayer how the divine and the human are combined together. And so, um, current social issues, that's a very difficult question to answer. Um, the example I think of is perhaps ministries that care for the poor. I know there have been a number of them that have been, well, in some cities they are shut down. In one particular city, Mobile, there was a homeless ministry there that they would actually feed the hungry, and the government forced the homeless people to no longer come because they were, they were dirty. They were bothering people because of their presence. And so Mobile shut that down. The guy who ran the homeless ministry got thrown in jail actually, because he continued the ministry because he knew those people needed food. So perhaps a form of prayerful protest there would be helpful. It's hard to really know, to be honest. But that is a good question. So Cade's questions. First we have Graham's winning of souls. What kind of prayer is that? Is that intercessory or prophetic? It depends on what you mean by intercessory. So if by intercessory you mean conversion of people to Christ, I mean I would put it under intercessory prayer probably, but it wouldn't be. It would be a very shallow view of intercessory prayer, in my opinion, because I think intercession should be not just for the cognitive belief of a person to be transformed, but their life, their circumstances, everything. So a holistic approach to their salvation, where they become changed in their morality and in their the sense of they have what they need to sustain their lives and to flourish and produce in this world. Um, so, yeah, that is basically my answer to that. The second question is, were people trying to invoke crisis, or did crisis result from divine response to prayer? So in my discussion on performative prayer, it's a form of prayer that is meant to invoke crisis. Now by that I didn't mean that they are praying that bad things would happen. That's not what I mean. So maybe that didn't come out very clear, but what happens is people are praying in positions like in the streets, they're blocking traffic, they're in places where people are getting annoyed that they're praying, and they're praying very loudly, at some points very emotionally, and that's what invokes crisis. So it's not that the people are praying bad things against other people. They're doing the opposite. They're saying, a lot of them are praying that, these people's lives would be transformed, that they would no longer hate them for the color of their skin. That's actually one example I think I gave in my paper. Sorry, I didn't mention that example in my paper, but I did mention the example of the firefighters and the police officers who refused to release their hoses and the dogs on the people praying. So they were moved by the fact that they were praying, whether it was some sort of divine response that God intervened, or it was the fact that these people, the police officers and firefighters, were moved by the fact that people themselves were just praying, and they could not bring themselves to harm anyone who is in prayer. It it forced them to confront the reality that black persons are just as spiritual, they are just as Christian, they are just as loved by God, and so this is what invokes crisis. It forces people to deal with the situation. They don't have the option to any longer look away and choose to continue in the racism. The racism might not be an outright defiance of black persons, but it's passive racism. It's the fact that they choose to not relate to other people, people of different skin color, that they choose not to commune with them, that they choose not to go to church with them because of cultural differences. And so, and I mean, the difference of skin color, there's just, it forces confrontation. And so it's not confrontation in the sense of I'm trying um, to be violent toward you, but it's the fact that look at me, I'm a human being, I'm praying, and so that's what I meant there. So it's hard to answer whether God actually responded to their prayers. I do believe that God did respond to their prayers, but I can't point to any situation and say God did that, God did this. It's hard to point that clearly because it's hard to discern God's response in prayers so black and white like. But I do think that God was involved in working out reconciliation in this nation in this way. So let's see. Yeah, so I answered your question. They weren't praying for bad things. They were simply praying and bad things were done to them. Oftentimes through being beaten because they were praying, being, threatened with death. But it got other people thinking, like it forced what it does is it forces you either to be honest about your hatred of them or to realize that what you're doing is wrong. So that's the reality of what's going on. So number 3, what happens when Christians pray against each other? Good question, Kate. I have no idea how to answer that. I think perhaps God is able to cooperate with humanity in creative ways that He's able to see what's the best way to resolve a situation, and perhaps then prayers can be formed in such a way in God's mind that are not as harmful as they might have been when directed at each other. I don't know if that's the way that prayer works. Perhaps we have to face the consequences of some of our negative prayers against each other. I haven't really figured that out yet. I think there are consequences of what we pray, whether it's some sort of metaphysical or divine response, or so I do believe in the metaphysical and divine responses. So God does get involved, but there's also the psychological, the impact that it has on our minds, the way we pray. So if I pray violence all the time toward my enemies, then I'm going to want violence to be done toward my enemies. Now if I pray that resolution would come, that healing would come to my enemies, that they would be transformed, that's going to affect the way that I think about my enemies. So I hope that answers your question. I don't know if it did. Lastly, Rebecca's questions. So, do spontaneity and extemporaneous prayers, do they arise out of need and emotions that lead to stronger action? I don't doubt that emotion does lead to action, and I think this can be seen evidently in the civil rights movement, that the current situations that they were facing caused strong emotion because it was their brothers and sisters, their black brothers and sisters, who were suffering, who were being bombed by white supremacists. Their churches were being destroyed. They were being beaten by police officers. It goes on. And I mean, okay, so I'll say that they are strong. Emotions are strong, and so these spontaneous motive prayers are important, but I don't think that they're the only thing that are important in prayer. I think that the other forms, contemplative, all those things are important too. And Dr. King himself would actually take time to withdraw, pray, and in sort of a contemplative, meditative way. It may have not been as it was intentional in the sense of he knew when he was going to pray. He knew all these things. And even during the civil rights movement, you have examples of people using pre-written prayers. Now, King himself didn't do that, so that's in a lot of people in the civil rights didn't, but there were some who did. And I think that it helps to set the agenda of what you're praying for. Now, it doesn't mean that King's prayers were random, because his prayers were all girded in his sermons, which were very well prepared, very well, you know, they were seated in times of prayer that he had. And so a lot of those prayers that he had in the sermons were then reflected in the way that he prayed in the civil rights movement, the way that he prayed in his church, the way that he did all these things. And so I hope that answers your question. Okay, so do these prayers, emotional, extemporaneous, are they more genuine, and are they therefore more transformative, like Hyler might say? They're not necessarily more genuine, and they're not necessarily more transformative, because emotions do run dry. People can't be expected to have these fiery emotions all the time. It's impossible psychologically. People will get worn out, especially in movements like this. You're going to get tired at some point, but you do press on. So, it might seem as though they are more transformative, but I think that's because of the feelings that we get. We have feelings that they're transformative. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are more transformative. But the thing is, I think we connect faith so much with our inner feelings about whether we actually feel like something's happening. And I'm not saying that positive feelings in relation to God aren't important, but that doesn't necessarily equate with genuine faith. Genuine faith is a stepping out. It's an embodied action, I think, is what I would define faith as now after this prayer class, rather than having the right feelings all the time, because there aren't any right feelings that you have to have 100% of the time. We're human beings. We're complex when it comes to emotions, just like any creature. So, what's more important, inward or outward transformation? Good question. So, Billy Graham thinks that both of them are important, at least in his confession, and so did King, at least in his confession. And so the difference was that Billy Graham said that first we need to change the hearts of the people. So evangelism, prayer, those things will transform people from being racist. So the problem with that was that Billy Graham himself, even after being converted to Christianity, he did not automatically become not racist. That just didn't happen. Same thing in India with the Dalit, the untouchables, the people who are considered the lowest class within this structure of religion. That was, there's a long history behind it. But the point is that even after evangelism took root there, the gospel took root there was still a lot of racism. And the problem was people were not confronting each other. They were not dealing with each other. So the Dalit they continued to go under the veil of being, less than important human beings are. Less than, not as valuable. So that's the main issue. So to answer your question, I disagree with Billy Graham on that. King, on the other hand, would say that transformation starts with society, and so when you make society in such a way that the laws are just laws and they call for equality between every human being, that every human being is enabled to flourish as a human person, that each human being is able to get what they need to sustain and to flourish in this world. and there is no obstacle put upon the black person or the Asian person or the immigrant, the person of this religious background or that religious background, or whatever form of marginalization might occur. King says we need to make just laws, laws that call for equality, that bring hope and justice to the poor, to the marginalized. Um, but the problem is, okay, so that's what causes the heart transformation. Now that segregation is over, I have to deal with my black brother and sister. I can't go living without facing them. I go to the water fountain, they're there. I go to the store, they are there. I go to the bathroom, they're there. You can't ignore them anymore. That is the issue with Billy Graham's model. It does not it ignores the reality of if I my experience with my brother or sister of a different background transforms me. It has an impact on me. Not prayer alone, but action connected to prayer. Action connected to devotion to God. And I think even in Christ's ministry, you see that. You see a love for God. You see love for humanity placed at the center of love for God. So I think that's my problem with Graham. He separates the two too much. And he thinks that love for God will always anticipate a further love for neighbor. I think you have to work on your love for neighbor just like you have to work on your love for God. There's not an automatic vertical transformation and then automatic horizontal. It doesn't work like that perfectly. Ideally, we all hope for that, but it just doesn't work that way out in reality. So I hope that answers your questions, Rebecca, and I hope that answers all of your questions. And thank you. I enjoyed class with you. I enjoyed class with you, Skip. And I hope you enjoyed my paper. See you guys later. All right, bye.